Good evening, everyone, and we'll hop straight into the PowerPoint. I will tell you mine is not nearly as much fun as the video, but we'll still get through it together. And I will also tell you that this PowerPoint is much shorter than the last one. We don't have to go to redistricting school again, because where we are at in the process here is this is the second hearing before we have draft maps. And this is really the hearing where, rather than last time where I was doing a lot of talking to you, or hopefully not at you, about redistricting, this is your chance and the public's chance to really provide feedback on what you want to see in potential draft maps. And that's important because after this meeting, I will start going to work putting together multiple options for reconfiguring the district boundaries. And in addition, for the public, as was referenced in the video, we're asking that if the public would like to submit their own plans, they do so by February the 3rd. And the reason for that date is so that there's enough time to take those maps and we're going to digitize them and run statistics on them and run maps on them. And we're going to treat them exactly the same, whether I drew them or whether the public drew them. And the goal is to make sure that those maps are out at least 7 days before that February 17th date. And that's important because people who might be interested in the process but may not have time to submit their own plans will still be able to look at those and say what works and what doesn't, what they like and what they don't. That third hearing is when we'll present those plans. As a reminder, you're not locked into plans at that meeting. That meeting actually is to provide additional direction to produce refined maps, which you'll look at that March hearing. And then if that March hearing, if there's a map that's close but not quite there, we can actually do live line drawing and actually change the boundaries during the course of the meeting, with the goal of having that meet at the end of that March meeting, having new plans in place that you'll be using for the next 10 years. So it is an iterative process. In the iterative process for tonight, one thing that's important to note is that tonight you do not need to reach consensus. So if there are places where different council members have different opinions, that's perfectly fine, because again, I'm going to produce multiple different maps and multiple different options, and it'll allow you to see what the impact of that differing direction is. To the extent there is direction tonight, which is sometimes a challenge for folks to figure out what they want to look at. As a reminder, these are the redistricting criteria under state law that we're going to look at. I'll touch on a few briefly. Again, I promise we won't go to redistricting school again, but this is one way to think about ways to give direction, is to go back and look at those criteria. So for example, what are communities of interest in the city you would like us to look at? What are ways you'd like us to balance out some of the population deviations we've seen due to changing demographics in the city? What are some understandable boundaries that you'd like to look at as potential district boundaries? All of those are kinds of things, if you're trying to figure out what do I want to say tonight, either if you're a member of the public or the council, those are ways to think about it. Again, I'm not going to touch on every criteria, but I'm going to touch on a few very quickly. One, just before we get going, and as was referenced in the videos, even though we just went through this process a few years ago, when you see references to the current demographics, it's actually not the lines as were adopted, because there's a couple of things that have happened. One is the city has annexed some area, which you can see in the map. So those areas have been added to districts in the intervening years. And the other thing is, thanks to our friends in DC, there are a couple of places where the existing district boundaries don't follow the new census geography. And we need to use that census geography because that's the only way we know whether the districts are of equal size. So there are a couple of places where we know we're going to have to make changes just because of, again, unfortunately, stuff we got from our friends in DC. So again, when you see the statistics I'm about to run, it's based on that map on the right. You're not locked into that map in any way, shape, or form. It's just a place to kind of get the conversation going. As we look at those maps, a couple things to note are, one, when we talk about equal population, the measure we're going to look at is what's the difference between that biggest district and that smallest district. So in this case, District 3 is at plus 14.9, and District 4 is at minus 8.1, which creates what's called a total deviation, that difference, which is 23%. The general rule of thumb is that we want that number to be under 10%. So we do need to make some adjustments, in particular, taking some areas out of District 3, and we need District 4 to grow a little bit. That doesn't mean you can't make other changes. This is an opportunity to look at other changes if they are desired, but those are some minimum changes we need to do to, again, reflect the growth in the city. Because as a reminder, when the lines were drawn, even though it was only a few years ago, we were using 2010 census data, not 2020 census data. The other thing to note here is that 2 of the districts do have Asian majorities of the citizen voting age population. That's something that may trigger requirements under the Federal Voting Rights Act. So something we would be looking at and presenting to you in draft plans to make sure we're complying with that federal law, to make sure that we're not diluting the voting rights of those groups. The other thing I want to highlight of the existing criteria just quickly, because this is an important place for folks listening in who may not care about redistricting, may not care about how this body is elected, but do want to weigh in, is the idea of a community of interest. And as the video said, those are simply just who do you go with? And that's an opportunity for folks to weigh in, because there may be existing data sets that are a good place to look and a place to reference. So for example, in the last project, school enrollment zones were one of those places to look at. Is that a good measure or not? That's something to get feedback on. But you're not bound by those existing data sets, and there is no fixed data set of communities of interest. So this is an opportunity to either refer to existing data sets or to just say, here's my community of interest and here's where it is in the city, and we'd like to be kept whole, whatever that community may be. So we're going to try to get districts of relatively equal size. That doesn't mean exactly. We're going to look at those criteria we talked about while making sure we follow the Federal Voting Rights Act, but at the same time, not using race as the predominant factor, which is prohibited under federal law. Really quickly, as was referenced, there's a great web page available for those who might want to submit plans. That's where those tools are. For those who might want to submit a map of their community of interest, that's where those are. Again, we're trying to get those in by February 3rd. And then really quickly, before I stop talking, just as a reminder, we also do have, for tonight's purposes, this interactive software of the map of the city. So for example, and these layers can be turned on and off. So right now, for example, you're seeing the lines as they were when originally adopted. We're able to change over, and you can see where the annexes change those boundaries. And then we're able to change over, and you can see those couple of areas where you can see the census geography is forcing some changes to be considered. So those are all things that we have available in here. We also have plenty of other information, like I said, about school enrollment zones, police beats, land use, lots of homeowners associations. So for Mr. Mayor, I will defer to you. We can have this map up at any point during the meeting, during debate and discussion, or just when something comes up, or we can have it down just as a tool to facilitate that direction this evening. And with that,